The orbital station floated in the blackness of space like a shining city. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but inside it buzzed with noise and tension. Dozens of alien ships were docked, each one carrying representatives from different worlds. They had all come for one purpose, the great trade negotiation that would decide the future of commerce between the stars. Mira walked through the long glass corridor that led to the council chamber. Her steps were steady, but her hands clenched. The small tablet she carried, she had been chosen to represent Earth, a planet that was still new to the interstellar community. For many of the species gathered here, humans were still a mystery. For others, they were simply ignored. Mira knew this. She had read the reports, seen the dismissive comments, and heard the whispers when humans first entered the council. The chamber itself was massive, a circle of towering chairs surrounding a table large enough to land a shuttle on. The air smelled faintly metallic, mixed with a strange sense of alien atmospheres. Bright lights illuminated every corner, but shadows clung stubbornly between the tall seats. It was both beautiful and intimidating, designed to remind anyone who entered of the power this council held. Mira's gaze moved to the other delegates as she took her place. To her right sat a representative from the Corran, their scaled body glistening like polished stone. Across from her, a delegate from the Lithari adjusted the folds of their long robe, their eyeless face turning toward the center of the table. They nodded politely at her, though she could not tell if it was respect or mere courtesy. And then there was M.A or VON. He stood at the far end of the chamber, his posture perfect, his feathered crest rising high above his head like a crown. The Villari were tall, elegant, and proud, and Arvin embodied every bit of their reputation. His feathers shifted slightly as he moved, shimmering in hues of gold and green under the bright lights. His sharp eyes scanned the room, but when they passed over Mira, they did not stop. It was as if she were not even there. She had expected this. Mira had studied the Villari and their culture. They saw themselves as one of the oldest and most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy. To them, humans were still children playing at diplomacy. They had allowed Earth a seat at the table because of political necessity, not respect. Mira knew it would take more than words to earn their attention. But even knowing that did not make his dismissal any easier to bear. The sound of footsteps and the clinking of ceremonial armor filled the chamber as the final delegates entered. When everyone had taken their seats, the lead moderator, a calm and ancient being from the Serati, raised a hand. "Welcome, honored delegates," the moderator said, their voice soft yet commanding. "We are gathered to decide on the proposed trade routes that will connect our worlds for the next century. May our discussions bring prosperity to all." The words were simple, ceremonial, but Mira felt their weight. This negotiation could change everything for Earth. If she could convince the Council to include her planet in the major routes, it would open the door to trade, knowledge, and opportunities her people had only dreamed of. But first, she had to be heard. The first hours passed slowly. One by one, the representatives presented their proposals. Arvin spoke often, his voice smooth and confident as he defended the Villari's interests. His words carried authority, and when he finished, other delegates nodded in agreement. Mira waited for her turn, listening carefully, adjusting her strategy with every new argument. When she finally rose to speak, she felt dozens of alien eyes on her. "Honored council members," she began, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Earth proposes a shared route along the Orion Gate, connecting not only Villari and Corran territories, but also smaller emerging worlds. This will allow for an equitable—" Arvin interrupted before she could finish. "The Orion Gate is too valuable to waste on minor worlds," he said, his tone sharp but polite enough to pass as diplomatic. "It is the lifeline between the core colonies. Humans do not understand its importance. Their suggestion lacks the experience required for such matters." Mira paused, letting his words settle. She could feel the shift in the room as some of the others glanced between them. The Villari delegate had dismissed her openly, as though she were a child speaking out of turn. She forced herself to stay calm, respectfully. "Ambassador Arvin," she said, meeting his gaze, Our analysis shows that including smaller worlds will strengthen the network, not weaken it. Shared routes build shared security and shared profit. Arvin tilted his head slightly, the feathers along his crest bristling faintly. That may be true for your small world, but the Villari do not gamble with what we already control. He did not even call her by name. Mira's fingers tightened around her tablet. She wanted to say more, to challenge him, but she knew pushing too hard now would only make things worse. The Villari were known for their pride. If she clashed with him openly, he would only dig in deeper. So she took her seat, silent. Arvin did not spare her a second glance. As the discussions continued, Mira kept writing notes. She observed which delegates nodded when she spoke, which ones hesitated, which ones avoided looking at her. She listened carefully, piecing together a plan. If she could not win their respect with words alone, she would need to find another way. The first day of talks ended with no agreements. Delegates rose and drifted out in groups, some deep in conversation, others silent. Mira walked out alone, her head high despite the sting of being ignored. Earth had sent her here to make a difference, and she would, even if no one saw it coming. The second day of negotiations began with the same heavy formality as the first. The chamber lights brightened slowly to match the simulated sunrise, a reminder that even in deep space, the rhythms of different worlds had to be respected. Mira entered quietly, tablet in hand, her face calm though her mind was sharp and alert. She had spent the night reviewing every proposal and counter-argument. If she wanted Earth's voice to be heard, she needed a new approach. The room filled quickly. Representatives from dozens of species took their seats, some conversing in low voices, others silent and observing. The Coran delegate, with their stone-like skin and rumbling voice, nodded briefly at Mira as she passed. It was small, but it was a sign of acknowledgement. She would take that as progress. Arvin was already there, of course. He stood tall and still, his feathered crest perfectly arranged. He had a habit of positioning himself where the light caught his feathers, as if to remind everyone of his presence. When Mira entered, his sharp eyes glanced over her without pausing, dismissing her existence as naturally as breathing. Mira felt a small sting in her chest, but she pushed it away. He wanted her to feel small. She would not give him that victory. The moderator began the day's session with a brief statement. Today we will continue discussions on the allocation of major trade routes. Delegates may present revised proposals. That was Mira's chance. She had rewritten her plan overnight, making it more appealing to larger powers while keeping the needs of smaller worlds in place. When the floor opened for new proposals, she stood, her heart steady. Honored council members, Mira said, her voice clear. Earth's revised plan suggests a tiered route system. The primary trade lines, including the Orion Gate, will remain prioritized for high-volume worlds like the Villari. However, secondary branches will be integrated, linking emerging systems to the main network without reducing efficiency for core trade lines. This structure ensures stability and growth for all participants. Her words were concise and practical. She had chosen every sentence carefully. A few delegates murmured quietly to one another. One of them, the Lithri in their flowing robe, tilted their head toward her as if considering the idea. Mira felt a flicker of hope. Then Arvin spoke. The Villari see little value in adjusting our routes for worlds that contribute so little, he said smoothly. His voice filled the chamber with effortless authority. Secondary branches will only slow trade for those who matter. If these smaller planets wish to benefit from our networks, they should earn their place through proper channels instead of asking for charity. It was not just a rejection. It was a dismissal designed to end the discussion. Mira's jaw tightened, but she kept her face calm. Ambassador Arvin, this proposal does not reduce efficiency. In fact, it may strengthen. Arvin interrupted without hesitation. Your people have little experience in interstellar trade. The Villari have overseen these routes for centuries. We will not compromise our standards based on untested theories. His tone was polite on the surface, but beneath it lay the unspoken truth. He did not believe she had anything worth saying. The other delegates were watching closely now. Some seemed amused by the exchange, others avoided looking at her at all, as if following Arvin's lead. The Velari were powerful. Few were willing to openly oppose them. Mira could feel the heat rising in her face. Every instinct screamed at her to push back, to prove him wrong, to make him listen. But she remembered her training. Humans were still seen as outsiders. If she argued too aggressively, it would only reinforce their image of her as an inexperienced upstart. So she took a slow breath and said, "I understand your concerns, Ambassador. I will provide detailed projections to demonstrate how this plan strengthens the entire network." Arvin gave a small, dismissive nod, as if granting permission to someone far beneath him. "Do as you wish," he said. "The council will decide." The conversation moved on. Other delegates presented their proposals, their voices filling the chamber. But Mira barely heard them. She kept her focus on her tablet, adding notes. Adjusting her plan again, she refused to be shaken. During the break, she stood alone near the wide observation window. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a silent reminder of how small Earth still was in this vast galaxy. Yet that smallness did not mean insignificance. "Do not let him unsettle you," a deep voice rumbled. Beside her, Mira turned. It was the Corn delegate, up close, their stone-like skin seen even more imposing. Yet their tone held no threat. "You saw how he treated me," Mira said. "I have seen how the Velari treat anyone they consider beneath them," the Corn replied. "You are not the first. You will not be the last." But even stones crack with enough pressure. It was a simple statement, but it felt like encouragement. Mira offered a small, grateful nod. "Thank you." When the session resumed, Mira remained quiet, listening more than speaking. She watched the dynamics between the delegates. Who supported Arvin without question? Who hesitated? Who might be open to new ideas? Every glance, every gesture was a clue. She realized something important. Arvin controlled the room not just with his words, but with his confidence. He assumed his opinions were the only ones that mattered, and others followed his lead because he projected strength. If she wanted to be heard, she would need to change that dynamic. As the day drew to a close, no agreements had been reached. Delegates left in small groups, their conversations continuing in hushed tones as they exited the chamber. Arvin departed with two other high-ranking representatives, his feathers shimmering in the fading light. He did not look back at her once. Mira walked the quiet corridor toward her quarters, her mind racing. She could not match Arvin in authority or reputation, but she could find another way to influence the council. She would need allies. She would need strategy, and most of all, she would need patience. For now, she let herself rest. Tomorrow, she would return to the chamber with a new plan. The third day of negotiations began with a quiet tension in the air. Everyone in the chamber could feel it. The debates were going nowhere, and each delegation wanted to avoid being the first to bend. Mira walked in with her tablet pressed tightly to her side, her mind focused and ready. She knew the Velari ambassador would try to dominate the talks again, but she had spent the night planning how to handle it. Arvin was already there, standing tall and flawless in his ceremonial uniform, his crest feathers shining like polished metal under the bright chamber lights. He gave her a single glance and then turned away as if she did not exist. It was the same dismissal as before, but Mira did not let it break her. She walked to her seat with calm determination, taking her place among the circle of towering chairs that surrounded the large table. The moderator opened the session with their usual greeting, but even their calm voice could not hide the fact that the negotiations were becoming more strained. Delegates were tired, and impatience was growing. Mira could see it in their movements. A few shifted restlessly in their seats, while others avoided eye contact. She knew that if progress was not made soon, this meeting could collapse before Earth even had a chance to be heard. The debates began, each delegate speaking in turn. Arvin dominated the room as always, his smooth voice dismissing proposals he did not like and praising only those that benefited the Velari. Every time Mira prepared to speak, he cut the conversation away from her. He did it so effortlessly that the others followed his lead. Mira clenched her jaw but kept her composure. And then, unexpectedly. The station shuddered. At first it was a small vibration, barely noticeable. But then came a low hum, followed by a sudden jolt that made the massive chamber tremble. Mira grabbed the edge of the table as the gravity shifted without warning. Delegates shouted in confusion, their voices echoing in the high-ceilinged room. A heavy sound of metal scraping filled the air as several chairs slid across the polished floor. The Velari were graceful, but even Arvin stumbled as the shift threw him off balance. His tall frame wobbled, and his crest feathers puffed out in alarm. Mira stood quickly, trying to stabilize herself as she saw one of the smaller delegates fall forward. She rushed to help them, her human reflexes faster than most of the larger species in the room. But as she bent to help the fallen delegate, the gravity fluctuated again. Her feet slipped on the smooth floor, and she lost her balance completely. She fell backward, arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. Her landing was softer than expected. It took her half a second to realize why. She had landed on someone, and then she heard the muffled, outraged squawk beneath her. Mira's eyes widened. In horror as she turned her head, she was sitting on Arvin. For a moment, the entire chamber was silent. The great Velari diplomat, the proud ambassador who had treated her as if she did not exist, was sprawled across his own chair with Mira unceremoniously planted on top of him. Then the room erupted. Some of the delegates laughed openly, their voices filling the chamber. Others gasped in shock, unsure if they should intervene. The Corn representative let out a deep, rumbling chuckle that echoed against the walls. Even the usually reserved Lithari covered their mouth with their long sleeves. As if hiding their amusement, Arvin's crest feathers flared in bright, angry colors as he struggled beneath her. "Remove yourself at once," he barked, his voice sharp and filled with humiliation. Mira scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, stepping back to give him space. "The gravity malfunction." "I did not." "Enough," Arvin snapped, rising to his full height. He brushed at his feathers as if to erase the moment from existence. "This is unacceptable." Mira took another step back, keeping her voice calm despite the heat in her cheeks. "It was an accident, Ambassador. I did not mean you." "Humans have no respect for," Arvin began. But his words were drowned out by another round of laughter from one of the delegates. The Velari diplomat turned sharply toward them, his feathers stiff with outrage. But the laughter only grew louder. The image of the mighty Arvin being sat on by the small human representative was too much for them to ignore. Mira wanted to disappear into the floor, but she straightened her posture and kept her composure. She knew apologizing more would only make her look weaker. Instead, she stood silently and let the room settle. The moderator finally raised a hand, bringing order back to the chamber. "Delegates, please," they said firmly. This was clearly an accident caused by the station's gravity fluctuations. "Let us return to the matter at hand." Mira took her seat without another word. Arvin did the same, though his feathers remained puffed and his movements were stiff with anger. He refused to look at her, his face locked in a mask of pride. But the humiliation was clear. The rest of the session continued. But the energy in the room had changed. Mira noticed it immediately. The other delegates were watching her differently now. Before, she had been invisible, ignored like background noise. But after that humiliating accident, she had become the center of the room's attention. Some of the delegates even seemed amused by her calmness after such an embarrassing moment. She could see them whispering to one another, their eyes flicking toward her with new interest. Arvin, however, was silent for the first time in 3 days. He did not interrupt her when she spoke. When the session finally ended, Mira left the chamber as quickly as she could. Her heart was still racing from the embarrassment. She had not wanted to humiliate Arvin, and she knew he would not forgive her easily. But as she walked through the station's quiet corridors, a small thought came to her. In a strange way, that accident had done something no amount of careful speeches could accomplish. They were finally noticing her. And tomorrow, she would use that to her advantage. The 4th day of negotiations began with a hum that felt heavier than usual. Word of the accident had spread quickly. Mira could feel the change as she walked through the wide corridors. Toward the council chamber, delegates who had previously ignored her now gave small glances as she passed. Some smirked. Others kept their expressions neutral, but she knew they were all thinking about the same thing. She had sat on the Villari ambassador. Mira kept her head high despite the heat creeping up her neck. She had not meant for it to happen, and she had apologized sincerely. But she knew how alien politics worked. One public humiliation could damage a diplomat's image for weeks, maybe longer. Arvin had been the untouchable figure in the room, the one who carried himself as though no one could bring him down. Now that image had cracked, and everyone had seen it. Inside the chamber, the mood was different. Conversations were quieter, but sharper. Some delegates whispered in their own languages, their tones carrying a mix of curiosity and amusement. Others avoided looking at Arvin completely, and then he entered. Arvin strode into the chamber with perfect posture, his feathers combed to their immaculate arrangement, his face unreadable. He walked to his seat like a soldier preparing for battle. But Mira could see it, the subtle tension in his movements, the way his sharp eyes flicked briefly toward anyone who dared to look at him too long. He had been embarrassed, and the Villari did not forget such things easily. When the moderator called the session to order, Mira braced herself. She knew Arvin would not let the incident pass quietly. The discussion began with updates on trade projections. Mira listened carefully, preparing to present her revised plan when the moment came. But before she could speak, Arvin's voice cut through the air. "Before we proceed," he said, his tone smooth but layered with steel, "I must address the incident that occurred yesterday." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Arvin rose from his seat, his tall frame towering over the table. His feathers shifted slightly, catching the light as he spoke. "What happened was an insult to the dignity of this council and to the Villari people. I will not tolerate being treated as if I am furniture for the amusement of others." Mira's stomach dropped. She had expected anger, but this was worse. He was turning an accident into a public statement. "Ambassador Arvin," Mira said quickly, rising from her seat. "It was a gravity malfunction. I apologized sincerely at the time. There was no intention to disrespect you or your people." Arvin turned his gaze toward her, his golden eyes cold and sharp. "Intent does not erase humiliation," he said. "The Villari do not take such things lightly." Some of the delegates shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with interest. The Corn representative crossed their massive arms, watching closely. Mira felt the pressure of the entire room on her. She could stay silent, let the Villari frame the narrative, and hope it would pass, or she could stand her ground. She chose the latter. "With respect, Ambassador," she said evenly, "it was not humiliation. It was an accident during a technical malfunction. If anyone should take offense, it should be at the station's systems, not at the people trying to help one another during the incident." Her words were calm, but her heart raced. She could feel Arvin's anger radiating across the room. "You speak as if my dignity means nothing," Arvin replied, his voice rising. "I speak," Mira said, keeping her tone steady, "as someone who believes this council is meant for cooperation, not for posturing. We are here to solve problems that affect us all. Spending time on accidents distracts from that purpose." The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to Mira's surprise, a low chuckle came from the Corn delegate. "The human makes a point," they said, their deep voice rumbling. "If we spent as much time on trade as we do on wounded pride, we might already have an agreement." Several other delegates murmured their agreement. Arvin's feathers stiffened, the faintest tremor of outrage flashing across his face. For someone like him, this was not just a challenge, it was a loss of control. Mira sat back down, her hands resting lightly on her tablet. She forced herself to remain composed, even though her pulse was still thundering in her ears. The moderator, sensing the shift in the room, quickly steered the conversation back to the agenda. "Ambassador Arvin, Representative Mira, we thank you for your statements. Let us now proceed with the day's proposals." Arvin said nothing further. He sat, his movements rigid, his golden eyes fixed on the table. As the discussions resumed, Mira noticed something new. The other delegates were watching her, not as a curiosity, not as the human who had embarrassed the Valari. They were watching her as someone worth listening to. Her heart steadied. She realized what had happened. The accident had made her visible, but this moment had made her credible. By standing up to Arvin without losing her composure, she had proven she was more than an inexperienced representative from a minor world. She was someone willing to challenge one of the most powerful voices in the room and survive. The rest of the session moved faster than the previous days. Delegates debated proposals with renewed energy, and Mira found that when she spoke, fewer interrupted her. The Lithri delegate even asked her to clarify part of her revised plan, giving her a rare opportunity to explain it in detail. When the session ended, the delegates left in clusters, still talking among themselves. Mira gathered her notes slowly, taking in the quiet sense of accomplishment that was beginning to replace her earlier embarrassment. As she left the chamber, she heard a low voice behind her. Human. She turned. Arvin stood there, his face unreadable. His feathers were still perfectly arranged, but his eyes burned with something between anger and reluctant acknowledgement. "Do not mistake this council's amusement for victory," he said softly. "The Valari remember everything." Mira held his gaze. "Then remember this, Ambassador," she replied calmly. "Earth is here to stay." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Arvin turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the corridor. Mira exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She knew Arvin's pride would not allow him to forget the incident or the challenge she had just made, but she also knew this, for the first time, the Valari ambassador had spoken to her directly, and that was progress. The fifth day of negotiations was quieter than the ones before. The delegates spoke in lower voices, their words more measured. The tension between Mira and Arvin had changed the rhythm of the council, and everyone could feel it. Mira walked into the chamber with her tablet, her face calm but her thoughts busy. The previous day had been exhausting. Standing up to Arvin had felt like standing in the middle of a storm, but she had done it. She had proven she would not be ignored. Still, she knew she had not truly won anything yet. The real goal, Earth's inclusion in the major trade routes, was still out of reach. She glanced across the room. Arvin was already in his seat. His posture was perfect as always, his feathers groomed into their usual immaculate display. Yet there was something different about him. He did not look at her with the same sharp dismissal as before. He did not acknowledge her either, but she could feel his attention in the small ways he shifted when she spoke to others. The session opened with routine updates. Delegates shared reports. But Mira noticed Arvin was quieter than usual. He spoke only when needed, offering short responses instead of his usual long speeches. She wondered if he was simply avoiding another public clash with her. When the floor opened for revisions, Mira presented a new version of her plan. She had simplified the root tiers even further, making them more efficient for the larger powers while still leaving room for smaller worlds to benefit. As she spoke, she made sure to direct her words to the entire council, not just Arvin. "This network is designed for growth," Mira said, pointing to the projections on her tablet. "It allows trade to flow to the core routes without delays, while creating opportunities for smaller planets to connect. This strengthens the entire network, not just one group of worlds." When she finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Corn delegate rumbled in agreement. "This is worth consideration," they said simply. Mira gave a polite nod, hiding the relief she felt. A public show of support, even from one delegate, was a small but meaningful victory. Arvin said nothing. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, his sharp eyes unreadable. The rest of the session passed without incident. When the meeting was adjourned, Mira left the chamber quickly, wanting time alone to review the reaction she had seen. She had no idea that while she walked away, Arvin stayed behind. The Valari diplomat sat alone in the vast chamber, staring at the holographic displays left hovering in the air. His feathers were still, his breathing slow. He replayed Mira's presentation in his mind. He had dismissed her from the moment they met. Humans were young, inexperienced, and too eager to climb higher than they belonged. They lacked the long history of the Velari, the centuries of wisdom that came with being one of the galaxy's great powers. To him, she had been nothing but a minor player trying to stand among giants. And yet, her proposal was clever. He pulled up the data she had provided, reviewing it with a critical eye. At first, he wanted to find flaws, to prove to himself that her ideas were childish. But as the minutes passed, his expression shifted. Her projections were sound. Her logic was clear. She had found a way to balance the needs of the core roots with those of the smaller systems. It was not just practical. It was strategic. Arvin leaned back in his chair, his golden eyes narrowing. He hated to admit it, even to himself, but the human had done her work well. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. It was the Lithri delegate, gliding silently into the chamber. "You are still here, Arvin?" they asked in their soft, musical voice. "I'm reviewing the human's proposal," he said simply. The Lithri tilted their head. "And what do you think of it?" Arvin's feathers shifted slightly, betraying his reluctance. "It is unexpected." The Lithri gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes the youngest voices have the freshest ideas. Perhaps you should listen more closely." They left without another word, their robe trailing behind them like flowing water. Arvin stared after them for a long moment. Then he turned back to Mira's data. That evening, Mira sat in her quarters, reviewing her notes. The station was quiet now, most delegates tucked away in their private chambers. She had been replaying the day in her head, thinking of how to make her arguments stronger for tomorrow. She had no idea that, at that very moment, her greatest opponent was studying her work. Arvin spent hours dissecting her proposal. He ran simulations, tested alternative routes, and compared them to his own plans. The more he worked, the more he realized her approach might solve problems even his team had overlooked. He hated the thought, but he could not deny the truth. By the time he finally closed the projections, his feathers had settled into a calmer pattern. The human had earned a place in his thoughts. The next morning, the delegates gathered once again. Mira entered the chamber prepared for another day of being talked over, ignored, or dismissed. She steeled herself for it, but when the discussions began, something surprising happened. Arvin spoke in favor of one of her points. It was subtle. He did not praise her by name, nor did he make it seem as if he agreed with her completely. But he referenced one of her root structures and argued that it had potential to benefit the core networks. Mira blinked in surprise. She glanced at him, trying to read his face. But he did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the table, his voice calm and controlled as always. The other delegates noticed. If the Velari were willing to entertain a human's ideas, perhaps those ideas carried more weight than they had first assumed. For the rest of the session, Mira kept quiet, but inside, her mind was racing. Something had shifted. She did not know why Arvin had changed his tone, but she understood what it meant. Her voice was finally breaking through. The sixth day of negotiations began with an unusual quietness. It was the kind of silence that hinted at change. Delegates moved more deliberately, speaking to one another in hushed tones as they entered the chamber. Even the usual posturing between the larger powers seemed subdued. Mira walked through the doors with her tablet pressed against her side, feeling the weight of the moment. She had spent much of the night refining her arguments, but there was something else she could not stop thinking about. Arvin's unexpected words from the previous day. For days, he had dismissed her at every turn. But then, without warning, he had supported one of her points. However subtly, it had been small. But in a room where influence was everything, it was like a spark in the dark. When she entered, her eyes went immediately to him. Arvin was already seated, tall and composed, his feathers perfectly arranged. He looked as unshakable as ever. If he felt any change toward her, he did not show it on his face. His golden eyes were focused on the table's holographic displays, scanning the day's agenda. Mira took her seat, forcing herself to stay calm. She did not want to assume too much. Perhaps his support had been nothing more than a calculated move, but perhaps, just perhaps, it meant something more. The moderator called the meeting to order. Delegates, they said in their soft, commanding tone. Today we move closer to finalizing the framework for the trade routes. Proposals and amendments may be presented for final consideration. This was it, the final stage. Mira waited as the first few delegates spoke. The Corn rumbled through their arguments for resource-heavy routes. The Lithari suggested shifting certain gates to balance traffic. Mira listened carefully, adjusting her own plan in her mind to account for their priorities. Finally, the floor opened. Mira stood, feeling every pair of eyes on her. Honored delegates, she began, keeping her voice clear and measured. Earth proposes a balanced integration system. The primary trade routes will serve the largest networks, ensuring efficiency for the core colonies. However, secondary and tertiary branches will link emerging worlds, allowing them access to opportunities that strengthen our shared economy. This system has been simulated for long-term sustainability and growth. She presented her revised projections, the holographic display lighting up with flowing trade lines that wove between planets like strands of silk. It was her strongest proposal yet, combining the needs of powerful worlds with the hopes of smaller ones. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. A few delegates leaned forward, studying the data. Others whispered to one another. Then Arvin rose. The movement drew every eye in the room. When the Villari ambassador spoke, people listened. The human's plan, Arvin said. His voice smooth and steady, is efficient. It accounts for the needs of the core networks while giving the lesser systems room to develop. The Villari see potential in this arrangement. Mira felt her chest tighten in surprise, but she kept her face neutral. Arvin continued. While we will require additional safeguards for the Orion Gate, the Villari are willing to support this framework as a basis for negotiation. The room erupted in murmurs. Some delegates glanced at one another with raised brows. Others adjusted their stances immediately. It was one thing for a human to present a proposal. It was entirely different for the Villari to endorse it. The Corn delegate leaned back with a rumbling sound that might have been approval. If the Villari support it, I will reconsider my position, they said. The Lithari delegate added, it is practical. It could work. Mira felt the shift happening. In real time, her idea was no longer an outsider's dream. It was a viable plan, backed by one of the most influential powers in the room. She glanced at Arvin. He had returned to his seat, his expression calm, his feathers still. He did not look at her. He did not need to. His support had already spoken, louder than any private words could. For the rest of the session, the discussion revolved around her framework. Delegates debated specifics, adjusted percentages, and requested minor changes. But they kept her core design intact for the first time since these negotiations began. Mira felt like she truly belonged at that table. When the session adjourned, delegates lingered to discuss the new direction. Mira gathered her things slowly, still processing what had happened. As she prepared to leave, a familiar voice came from behind her. Representative Mira. She turned. Arvin stood there, his posture as commanding as ever. Yes, Ambassador, she replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. Arvin's golden eyes studied her for a moment. Then he said, your projections were sound. Better than I expected. It was not an apology. It was not praise, either. But coming from him, it was more than enough. Thank you. Mira said simply. He inclined his head slightly, almost like a bow, then walked away. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Arvin, the proud Villari diplomat who had treated her like she did not exist, had not only supported her plan, but had acknowledged her work. It was more than progress. It was respect. The seventh and final day of negotiations arrived with an air of finality. The delegates moved with purpose, their steps quicker and their conversations sharper. They all knew that what was decided today would shape trade for the next century. Mira walked toward the chamber with her tablet held firmly in her hands. She felt the weight of the moment more than ever. For days, she had been ignored, dismissed, and humiliated, but now she had a seat at the table that truly mattered. Her proposal, once brushed aside, was now the foundation of the council's discussions. When she entered the chamber, She noticed the difference immediately. Delegates who had once avoided looking at her now greeted her with small nods or polite acknowledgments. It was subtle, but it meant everything. She had earned a place among them. Arvin was already seated, his feathers gleaming under the bright chamber lights. He did not look at her, but she could feel his awareness of her presence. She remembered his words from the day before. Your projections were sound. It had been the closest thing to praise she could expect from him. The moderator called the meeting to order. Delegates, today we finalize the framework for the new trade network. All amendments must be resolved by the end of this session. The first hours were filled with debate. The quorum pushed for greater access to mineral-rich roots. The Lithari wanted protections for cultural exchange channels. Mira listened carefully, adjusting her plan as needed, offering compromises when necessary. She knew when to push for her points and when to step back every time she spoke. The room listened, and then, as the discussions grew heated over access rights to the Orion Gate, Mira saw an opening. She stood. Honored delegates, she began, her voice steady. The Orion Gate is the lifeline of this network. It cannot belong to one power alone. It must serve the collective good. That is why I propose a rotational oversight council. Each major power, including the Villari, Corrin, and Lithari, will share responsibility for its security and operation. Smaller worlds will have advisory input to ensure the gate serves everyone. The room fell silent for a moment. It was a bold idea. Too bold, perhaps. Arvin rose from his seat. Mira braced herself, expecting him to dismiss her. But instead, he said, the Villari will consider this arrangement. Shared oversight ensures stability. Provided safeguards are in place to protect traffic priority for the core networks. Mira blinked. It was not a rejection. It was support, delivered in the carefully measured way of a Villari diplomat. The Corrin rumbled their agreement. If the Villari can support it, so can we, the Lithari added. A rotational system is acceptable with proper regulation. One by one, the other delegates followed, some offering small adjustments, others voicing outright support. Mira exhaled. Slowly, it was happening. Her plan, with all its layers and compromises, was becoming the framework for one of the most important trade networks in the galaxy. The final hours were spent refining details. Percentages of control were adjusted. Safeguards were written. Advisory roles for smaller worlds were formalized. Mira fought for every clause that ensured Earth's inclusion, and with each agreement reached, she felt the weight of her planet's future becoming more secure. When the last signature was added to the holographic treaty, the moderator stood. Delegates, they said, their calm voice carrying the gravity of the moment. The interstellar trade framework has been ratified. This network will serve as the foundation for prosperity between our worlds for the next century. Let this be a testament to what can be achieved when we work together. The room erupted in polite applause, the sound echoing through the vast chamber. Mira sat down slowly, letting the moment wash over her. She had done it. Earth had done it. As the delegates rose to leave, Mira gathered her things. She wanted to return to her quarters, to breathe, to finally let herself rest. But before she could leave, a shadow fell across her table. Representative Mira, she turned. Arvin stood there, tall and composed as ever. Yes, Ambassador? She replied, her tone calm but curious. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he inclined his head slightly. You argued well, he said. Better than most I have faced in this chamber. Mira raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of saying thank you? Arvin's feathers shifted in what might have been amusement. It is my way of saying you have earned your place here. The words caught her off guard. Coming from anyone else, they might have been ordinary. But from Arvin, proud, unshakable Arvin, they carried a weight she could not ignore. Thank you, Ambassador, she said simply. He studied her for a moment longer, then added, do not waste it. The galaxy remembers those who rise too quickly and those who fall. With that, he turned and walked away, his long stride carrying him toward the exit. Mira watched him go, feeling an odd mix of relief and curiosity. For all his arrogance, Arvin had recognized her, not as a nuisance, not as an accident, but as an equal, She left the chamber and walked through the station's long corridors. Outside the windows, the stars stretched endlessly, a reminder of how vast the galaxy was. Yet for the first time since arriving here, she did not feel small. Earth had a voice now, and so did she.